could you please tell us very quickly, obviously, why you're running for re-election, but also, can you specifically talk about your overall vision to support Massachusetts communities and their families?
So first of all, thanks for giving me a chance to spend some time here. I very much appreciate the work that we've done as an administration, working with many of you over the course of the past 4 years. I also want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to steal some of your talented players and bring them in to serve on our team. Crystal Cornegay obviously ran DHCD and now runs Mass Housing. Nam Pham is the leader of our Mass Office of Business Development, and Janelle Chan, who started doing real estate at the MBTA, is now doing Crystal's old job at DHCD, and of course Jay Ash is no stranger to anybody in this community. And I do think in some respects, if you get people into these positions who've actually got the right kinds of experiences, they can do great things with that. And some of the stuff I would speak to that we were pleased to work with you all on, one would obviously be the increase in the state's investment in housing generally. We increased the state's housing allocation by about 20% after we took office. Through a series of conversations with many of you, we also tweaked and torqued the HDIP program, which was really not doing a heck of a lot in gateway cities given the way it was organized. There were a handful of projects. There are now 42 that are either under construction, in the pipeline, approved or ready to go. We've also made major investments in greening gateway cities. Thousands and thousands of trees have been planted, in many cases with community partners who can do the work associated with maintaining those plantings after they're done. And I would say 3/4 of the money that we've spent on upgrading our parks over the course of the past 4 years has been in parks that are either at, near, or close to gateway cities and gateway communities. I also want to thank you especially for the work you did with us on the Earned Income Tax Credit. One of the things I learned during that debate when we first proposed expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit was it didn't have a natural constituency that was going to be willing to go to the State House and argue for it. And the CDCs in many respects and the anti-poverty agencies were the folks who really came to the fore and helped us make the case to the legislature, and as a result we got a 50% increase in that, which benefited about 450,000 working families here in Massachusetts, most of which are run by single moms. The final thing I'll say, and then I look forward to moving through the rest of the questions on this list, is the work that we've done in many respects has made it possible for us not only to pursue new projects, but also to preserve many existing projects. And that's going to continue to be something that we as a Commonwealth and we as administration are going to work on going forward. I would say that the ratio of new builds to preservation over the course of the past few years has probably been something close to 1-to-1. And that's in large part because, as you know, many of these projects are timing out, and we need to make sure that we're doing the things we need to do to continue to help people stay in place. And the other thing you've been tremendously helpful on is helping us get families out of hotels and motels. When we took office, there were 1,500 families in about 50 hotels and motels around the Commonwealth, almost all of which were far away from their support systems. In many cases, the kids weren't anywhere near their schools. The average length of stay in a hotel or motel was about 8 months, which basically meant the kids were losing a year's worth of education or traveling very long distances to get to and from school. No outside play space. I mean, everything about it was wrong. And with your help and with the help of a lot of other folks in the housing community, we were able to do 3 things. Number one, help people stay where they were so that they never became homeless in the first place. Number two, help us come up with strategies to help folks transition more quickly out of hotels and motels and back into the communities that they were familiar with, and transitional and then ultimately permanent housing. And number three, help us create strategies to ensure that we didn't end up with people coming back into the same system the same way. And today we have one hotel with 35 families in it at a point in time when the housing market, for all intents and purposes, didn't get that much better. And the final thing I'll thank you for is the work you did with us on the Housing Choice Initiative. It's unfinished business at this point in time, but I do believe that that approach, which involved sort of everybody who's part of the mix with respect to housing did for the first time create a pretty big coalition around something everybody could agree to with respect to housing production generally. And while it's still sitting in the House, our hope is that maybe in an informal session between now and the end of the year, and if not then, certainly, hopefully if we're still around in January, in the next legislative session, we can get a housing bill done to create more production, because simple truth is we don't have enough inventory. The inventory we have, when it becomes available, gets priced out of sight, and we are pushing people farther and farther and farther away from where they work, in many cases from the neighborhoods they're familiar with, and forcing them to have to travel great distances to do practically anything. And that is really a function of supply, and that supply problem is creating a price issue, and it's creating huge issues with respect to equity and a whole bunch of other issues as well. So you folks were incredibly helpful in helping us build that coalition, but we still have work left to do on that one, and I would hope that we can continue to pursue it if we're still around in January. Thanks.
Great. Let's jump right into housing, and particularly the MACDC members would like you to address the huge racial home ownership gap that we have in our state. Massachusetts has the third worst racial home ownership gap in the country. Here, the home ownership rate for the white population is twice than that of the people of color. And in many communities of color or gateway city neighborhoods, the home ownership rate is less than 20%, which is very, very embarrassing. What will you do as governor, or what will you do to continue tackling this situation? And in particular, also, what would you do to increase the number of affordable home ownership opportunities available to low and moderate income families?
A big piece of what we've been up to for the past few years was around both preserving the existing rental capacity and growing new rental capacity. But whether you're talking about soft second loans or down payment assistance, those are things we would look forward to working with you folks on. But I will say this, part of what makes me a little more optimistic than I might have been a couple years ago about the possibilities in the gateway communities especially, is now that we have a whole bunch of projects that are going on in many of those communities, it creates a sense of momentum and a sense of opportunity that simply didn't exist there before. And I do think the opportunity, whether you're talking about down payment assistance or soft second loans or other approaches to this, are things that we would look forward to working with you on. And obviously, in addition to that, we did start the first home ownership counseling and education program and a foreclosure protection program this past year. I think there are 11 or 12 sites that are working on this stuff based on the money we put out. And the other thing I would say is I would like to bring the banks and the credit unions into this conversation in a pretty big way. I served on the board of a credit union for several years, and during a very difficult time in our economy, and that obviously had consequences for a lot of people, many of whom were of modest means. And one of the things I learned was there simply isn't a structure in place. Some of it's driven by statute at the state level, some of it's driven by statute at the federal level, to create a mechanism to protect people from foreclosure. And I think that is in many ways a big opportunity, especially if we can get the banks and the credit unions to agree on some strategies to deal with this that can then be incorporated into both law and regulation to do a better job of making it possible for people to stay in place and to come up with mechanisms to support them as they work their way through what in many cases is not a permanent issue with respect to their ability to keep current, but a temporary one that we simply don't have a mechanism in place that helps them fix.
Great. Switching gears a little bit, one of the key missions of MACDC's members is to help local businesses start and grow with programs like the Small Business Technical Assistance and the Small Business Matching Fund programs. Next year, in 2019, the governor and the legislature will have an opportunity to significantly expand those efforts. That's because the law that legalized gambling here in Massachusetts called for allocating almost 10% of revenue to the Economic Development Fund, and the Massachusetts Gaming Commission has called or has recommended that a portion of those dollars go to support programs by CDCs like the ones I mentioned and other organizations. Will you commit to allocating a substantial share of this Economic Development Fund dollars to help CDCs support disadvantaged entrepreneurs?
There's debate about how much we'll end up in that. I don't know what the number is going to be. It's probably going to be somewhere between 200 and 250 million. And the working assumption is that about 10% of that, plus or minus, which is somewhere between 20 and 25 million, would be deemed targeted for these types of initiatives. And my answer to that is yes. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be used for. Just recently, the Mass Growth Capital Corporation, through some work it did with us and it did with a bunch of other banks, created a loan program for a lot of the businesses that have been zero interest loan, 90 days, sort of through the transition period here we're dealing with up in Lawrence. And that is in many ways, I think, a terrific tool to continue to invest in. In fact, we also just put out I think a couple of $1 million worth of small business technical assistance grants to about 40 organizations around the Commonwealth using the MGCC as the mechanism for that. The only thing I would say about this generally is there are a bunch of folks who play in this space, okay, in addition to the CDCs and MGCC and the small business technical assistance community. And the only thing I would say is I would want to make sure we get all best ideas on the table with respect to where the best opportunities are to make investments in communities and the best investments in small businesses. But in terms of whether or not there should be a 10% plus or minus investment in small business, in gateway communities, in disadvantaged communities, in programming and opportunity associated with this sort of thing, my answer is yes. The only thing I would the other caveat would be if I can find people who are doing really interesting thing in workforce and skill building, that would be something we would want to try and support as well. But this should not, we all know what this money's for. It should be used to serve the people of the Commonwealth that it's intended to be used for in the best possible and highest use way, period.
So the Community Preservation Act has been a great tool for cities and towns in Massachusetts to invest in affordable housing, open space, historic preservation, etc. But as more and more towns have adopted it, the state matching dollars have declined from a dollar for dollar match to less than 20 cents. The deeds fee used to fund the match has not been increased in 18 years. So this is a two-part question. Number one, will you support increasing the deeds fee so the state matching funds can equal at least 50 cents on a dollar? And number two is, how will you make sure that every city and town lives up to the requirement that 10% of the funding be used for affordable housing?
18 years is a long time. It's obvious that there needs to be an adjustment made. One almost made it through the budget in the process last year. We would support that mechanism being increased. And I'm assuming that it will probably be taken up again in the legislative session. And if we happen to be in office and it does get taken up, we would support it and we would sign it. The second question with respect to the 10% issue, I was talking to Secretary Ash about this because this is not something I was familiar with. And what he said to me, so I'm going to say what he said. This is what he said. This isn't what I said, okay? But he's a lot smarter about this stuff than I am. And what he said is that many communities bank the money for an extended period of time because they're planning to use it for some project at some point when they get to a certain point. I think the way to deal with this is to create some kind of reporting requirement with respect to sort of a 3 or 4 year plan with respect to how people are planning to spend this, because trying to do this on an annualized basis won't work if a lot of communities are treating this as a multi-year opportunity to raise money to support a series of initiatives. The way you would determine whether or not, in fact, they were living up to the requirements associated with the legislation, and this 10% question in particular, would be to require people to develop a plan. And that's something certainly that I think we can do within the existing regulatory framework. I don't think we need a statute for that. And that could be part of the DOR oversight for how the funds actually get spent and allocated, and a way to deal with the question and the issue that you're raising, which is not one, frankly, that until I saw this, I had heard much about. So the answer is yes, I think we can figure out a way to help deal with that.
As you know, health outcomes are influenced by socioeconomic factors like housing, education, employment. The Department of Public Health has adopted groundbreaking regulations to require hospitals to invest in efforts to address these social determinants of health. What will you do to accelerate this convergence between health and community development to drive health investment into community development and housing, and just in general address the social determinants of health?
So was that our Department of Public Health that pursued that groundbreaking initiative that you just spoke of? Yeah, I thought so. Let me just say this. First of all, some of you may be old enough to remember that I worked in state government in the 90s. When I worked in state government in the 90s, we were the first administration in the country to actually embed social service and health service programs in public housing to serve people with disabilities, seniors, and other folks who needed support to continue to live in the community. We were also one of the first states in the country to start putting our dollars into state health and human service funds for services and federal, mostly HUD, but other kinds of federal housing dollars to create social service support models, again, for seniors, disabled folks, physically and mentally, to create supportive service models for housing folks in those circumstances. And we did it over and over and over again, and some of those programs have been replicated all over the country. And one of the reasons why we have, by almost any measure, a much larger portion of our over 65 population living in the community and not living in nursing homes is because of some of the work that we did to create services and supports for people as they aged in the community. So, first of all, I believe in this. I've been doing it for a really long time, and I think it makes a huge difference with respect to our ability to be successful. And I would argue that the whole initiative around helping people get out of hotels and motels and back into housing in their own communities was, again, a collaboration between the Health and Human Service folks and the community housing folks and the folks at DHCD. The relationships here are really important, and they can do very good and very important things, which is part of the reason why we did the initiative through the DON project with DPH in the first place. One of the things I would put on you is to help us think differently about how these kinds of initiatives can be put together and how we could be helpful in either accelerating them or making them happen in certain places and certain programs. And I'll give you a simple example. We have an Open for Business program. That program involves putting state property that's currently not doing anything back to work. And it has led to hundreds of projects, mostly on the housing side, some affordable, some mixed use, some workforce. But those properties are one of our best assets that we can make available to folks who are interested in doing housing. And if it makes sense for us to help you think about how to incorporate services and supports, either with existing healthcare providers or with other folks, because that's an important need in a particular community. It can be done on a property that we own so that it doesn't cost somebody a lot to acquire it. That is definitely something that we would be interested in talking about and pursuing. I do think the best way to do this is with providers who already have some experience in what it is you're trying to accomplish, and it's best when directed at certain populations for whom the opportunity to be served at home or in the community is a far better alternative than the one that might otherwise be required for them. But again, I've been playing in this space for a very long time. Mary Lou Sutters, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, is a big believer in this. The folks at DHCD get it, and it's a place where we would be more than interested in working with you, because the more we can do to help people stay in place, stay in the community, maintain their connection to their friends, to their neighbors, to their family members, to the supports and the familiar faces that make it possible for them to stay healthy and active and independent, that's the place we want to play in, and
Great.
it's where we have played.
So I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on the campaign, and you've had two debates with your opponent, and it's interesting that housing hasn't been more of an issue. Why do you think that's the case? And can you share with us what you hear on the campaign trail about people's struggles with housing and just in general, why it hasn't been a bigger issue on the campaign and debates in the public arena?
So I bring it up every time I go anywhere, and I've brought it up in both debates. And the reason I brought it up in both debates, and I bring it up when I'm out and about, is because it's one of the major things I hear about when I am out. And I'll go back to my opening comments, which was, for a state that prides itself at being really good at a lot of things, we're not very good at housing production. We used to produce 30,000 units of housing every year for decades, like clockwork. And then starting in the 1990s, that number fell to somewhere around 10, 12, 8,000, and it stayed there for 25 years. So for 25 years, we've been building half the housing capacity that we used to build every single year like clockwork for decades. So we don't have a lot of inventory. When the inventory we have comes on the market, it gets bid up out of sight. That pushes people farther and farther away from where they work, the neighborhoods they're familiar with, and creates big issues for them with respect to transportation, housing, sort of all of the above. And part of the reason we spent a year with municipal government, land use people, environmental folks, home builders, community development corporations, public housing entities, and all the rest was to see if we could get people to agree on something with respect to how to enhance production. And we did. We finally got a deal with all of those folks around our Housing Choice Program. It came out of Kevin Honen's committee in the House, 12-1, and it's currently sitting in the House. And my hope is that if we can't get it done in the informal session, this will be, as I said earlier, sort of priority number one, 1A. Opioids will continue to be number one, but it'll be 1A coming out of the legislative discussion starting in January. And we have a very big bond bill. That bond bill has a tremendous amount of dry powder in it that we can use to do a lot of things, and we got a lot of things we were looking for in that bill to make it possible for us to do things we haven't been able to do before with our housing generally. But we need to create more, period. And I think one of the things we're going to push for, if I have another inaugural address, State of the State, whatever you want to call it, this issue is going to be front and center in it because it's an equity issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a transportation issue, it's a cost of living issue, it hits every single category you can think of with respect to how to build a healthy, great Commonwealth and how to build healthy, great communities. And we're just not getting where we need to be on it, period.
Mm-hmm. Just wanted to give you very quickly one last chance to mention anything else about your housing agenda that we haven't talked about. You did mention homelessness, but any other program or initiative that you want to highlight and that we haven't touched on that you want to?
Well, I'm pretty excited about the bond bill. That, to me, has one of the things that's in that bond bill, by the way, is a whole series of elements that haven't existed before that make it possible for us to do housing with supported services. And several of the first initiatives out of the box on that are places that have been working on that sort of thing for a while. Now, most of them are attached to elderly housing, but they don't have to be just attached to that. And I also finally think we have the right structure in place to do community scale housing, much smaller units, 5 to 20 instead of 150 to 300, which in many parts of Massachusetts is a heck of a lot more important and effective than the larger stuff. And like I said, there's a lot of resource there to do a lot of things with.
Last question. MACDC believes that partnership is the key to success. In that spirit,
So you're not going to ask me about the community investment tax credit?
Please, that's why I ask you if you want to go ahead.
One of the first things we learned in our first meeting with the CDCs was that the community investment tax credit was a really good idea, and the way state government had set up its process for administering it made it almost impossible to use. So, it was like 12 forms in triplicate, none of which connected to one another in any reasonable way. And, like the typical form you know, I mean, it's no joke. The form on it had like a line that was this long and said, every donor you possibly have who might be interested in doing this, you should put on this line. The thing was, so in any event, we cleaned it all up, and over the past few years, I think we've done 25 or 23, $24 million worth of CITC, which has generated $35 million in investments. So, and we filed a big expansion for it, and the legislature bought into it, and we're all in on it.
All right, last then. Would you agree to meet with MACDC leaders at least once a year to ensure open dialogue and maximum partnership between your administration and MACDC members?
First of all, those meetings we've had for the past 4 years have been incredibly helpful and have opened our eyes to stuff that we didn't know about. For example, that CITC program, those fixes that came out of that and the movement to go forward and expand it, that literally came straight out of those conversations. The Food Trust, which is a really cool program that I never heard of, and it came up, I think, in the first meeting we had with the CDCs, and now it's actually translated into a real program that's doing some really good stuff, and it actually created a cousin called the HIP program, which came up as a result of the work we did when we figured out how the Food Trust worked. And I think those meetings, the cliff effect, a lot of the conversations we've had about the cliff effect and ways we can actually help people manage to do better without having to worry about giving up all the supports that they've already got came from conversations at some of those meetings with you folks. And I think they're incredibly valuable. I think they're incredibly important. And those meetings aren't just for me or for the lieutenant governor. They're also for the people who work on our team. And, in kind of a weird way, if the folks who work on our team know that we're going to be sitting down with certain groups and certain communities to talk about stuff every once in a while, what they really want when those folks come in is to have those folks come in and tell the governor and lieutenant governor what a great job our administration is doing creating partnerships, chasing stuff, working on it, and getting it done. And so there's a certain push that comes with those meetings and a certain focus, which I think is really important. And I've said this before, I think you guys do a lot of different things. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of folks in public life who do certain things really well, and that's what they focus on. And they're good at it, and it's, thank God we have them, and they're there. And then there are other folks who do a whole bunch of things to solve a particular set of issues for a particular group of people in their community. But they're masters at a bunch of different things. But their focus is on a certain group of people in their community. And you folks do a whole bunch of things very well because your focus is on the people in the communities that you serve and represent. And that gives you a certain creativity and a certain capacity to stitch things together that would be hard for some of those folks who play focus games to do. And we learn a lot from all those conversations. As I said, we have many people working in our administration who we stole from you because they're really good at that stuff. And if we have a chance to have a second term, the door's open, and we'll look forward to continuing to build on the work that's been done and put some of the ideas that we talked about today, but many of the other ones that I'm sure you're going to come up with, to work for the people that we all represent and serve. And again, I appreciate the chance to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Governor. Give it up.